Ladies and gentlemen, as you realize, I am not in a position to answer any important question. You must regard me as the poor man's Hammershirt and must ask me extremely light and inexpensive questions. Now, I do not know whether you would like me to give a brief sketch on which you can hang your questions, or whether you would like to start off with the questions. Right. Well, as you know, we crossed over from here in an American military plane from here to London. We were in London about 24 hours. You know the people that Mr. Hammershirt and part of his party met in London. We left by a special chartered BOC plane for New Delhi, stopping for about 2 hours in Paris on the airfield where Mr. Mendes France came to meet Mr. Hammershirt. I think about 24 hours in Delhi, and then by an Indian plane from Delhi to Canton, which I understand did not go over the hump, but went over Burma and Thailand, and therefore made a rather difficult journey. We were dropped in Canton in the morning. It was a cold morning, and the clouds were very thick. When we came down from the clouds, we saw Canton surrounded by hills, and to my layman's eye it looked like a very difficult landing, but it was done absolutely perfectly. And the landscape, when we could see it, was extremely beautiful. And I remember it was described in the party as an extremely civilized landscape. We landed at Canton, were received by the foreign ministry representative in Canton. I found there, when we got there, that the foreign ministry has a representative in the provinces, has representatives in the provinces. We were taken into the city, where it had been snowing for some time, rather unusual for Canton, and people were all through the town busy digging up the snow. We went to a hotel where we had a lunch. There was an interpreter and an additional interpreter, a young schoolgirl who knew English reasonably well, was also brought to join the party. She must have been a high school girl. The interpreter that was with the party seemed to be a professional interpreter. We had this lunch there, and we took the plane again, this time a Chinese plane, which brought us to Hankow, where we stopped the night. The Hankow is one of the 3 towns altogether known as Wuhan. So we stopped at one of these towns, we crossed the Yangtze River and went to Hankow where we were lodged in a hotel. And we left next morning by the Chinese plane and arrived in Peking. According to me, it was very near the North Pole, so cold. There we were received the airfield by the whole diplomatic corps. The temperature was, I think, 10 to 15 degrees below zero. This is purely meteorological account. I was the only person in the party that has been used to a reasonable climate. Everybody else in his weaker moments had been an alpine climber. We arrived in this bitter cold. Of course, to me, the ceremony of shaking hands with all the diplomats seemed ages too long, because I wanted to get into the car. Frankly, I was feeling very cold. From there, we were driven to the hotel. Mr. Hammershirt and his personal staff stayed in the Swedish and the Norwegian embassies, and the rest of us stayed in the Peking hotel. which was very comfortable. By this arrangement, of course, I also got Mr. Hamishill's room, which was very nice, and much better perhaps than I otherwise deserved. And there we were installed. I think that afternoon we made a formal call on Mr. Chuen Lai in the room where the meetings subsequently were to be held, which was a room of Chinese architecture, ancient, traditional rather, and part, we were told, of the old palace. The building itself very happily was called the Hall of the Western Flowers. We found this out later on. We were most cordially received. I think the conversation was very genial, of course casual and relaxed. We came away and we were invited, before we came away, we were invited to a reception which was that evening held in the Hall of the Purple Light. After which Mr. Hamishchild, I think, went to dinner with the foreign minister. Of that dinner I cannot tell you anything because I was not there. That was the first day. After the conversation started, we met in this room every day at about 3 o'clock, generally dispersed between 5 and 6, one day at 8:10. That was the longest meeting we had, 5 hours and 10 minutes. During the course of the talks, you will one day see the photograph. It was Mr. Hamishchild and Mr. Chuen Lai sitting in the middle with the two teams flanked on either side. The team on this side, you know, on the other side was an advisor to the foreign ministry, the vice foreign minister, the assistant minister, and the director of the conference organization. I'm not getting the name right, but the sense of it is right. And of course, Mr. Chu's interpreter, who was Chinese, very competent interpreter. He told us in one of the relaxed moments in the conference that he was a Harvard graduate, although his English was not particularly transatlantic. During the course of the meeting every day, we were served with tea 3 times. I had more time to count these bouts of tea than my chief had, who was very busy, and he did not know sometimes whether he was drinking out of the present bout or the previous one. With the third, this was served, of course, in tall Chinese cups with lids on. Chinese tea, very light tea. With the third round, we also had some Chinese cookies. By that time, we thoroughly enjoyed them because we were hungry. There was generally no interruption. The tea nor the cookies interrupted the conversations at all, except one day I think there was a slight relaxation for about 5 minutes. Otherwise, the conversations were, so far as I could see, intense, earnest, and continuous. Of course, sometimes a whole speech was delivered or before it was translated. Sometimes it was cut up into parts. But the whole atmosphere was of great earnestness. There was not a sound, not a noise of any kind in the whole of the room. The servant that came, of course, the servant was dressed exactly like the Prime Minister. Everybody in China seemed to be dressed absolutely alike because they were all in blue. A coat buttoned up to the neck, jacket, and a pair of trousers, either cotton quilted or serge, woolen. And I was told that because of the winter, and this being the commonest cloth, blue was so much in evidence that in the summer more colors would be seen. Well, this went on day after day except for Sunday. I think one day in between, the party was taken to see an opera. I did not go with that party because I was dining in my own embassy on that evening. And on a Sunday we were taken to the party was taken to the summer palace, and the Ming tombs. On a day previous, we were taken to the Forbidden City, which stretched for so many miles that I could not finish it, so I stopped at the first halt, where in a small room there was a stove and some tea. On these occasions, about the worst person in the world to follow is Mr. Hammarskjöld, because he walked a terrific pace without a hat, which is unknown in China, and faster than anybody else. Air travel suits him. I asked him one day why he was so full of energy after coming out of an aeroplane. He said he's a modern man used to these modern methods of transport. Since that time, I'm waiting to see him jump out of a rickshaw one of these days. I suppose he can't do that. Well, that gives you then, on the way back, we had the last night we had a dinner with the Prime Minister. We came away next morning in the Chinese plane, which brought us to Canton, and then in a Chinese special train to Shenzhen, which is a border town between the mainland of China and Hong Kong. Then a Hong Kong train took us over to Kowloon and then to the island of Hong Kong, where we stayed the night, and next morning we took a Scandinavian plane to Tokyo. Within a matter of minutes, we changed from the Scandinavian plane into the American military plane, which brought us eventually to New York. That eventually is very carefully put there, because we had a short halt at Honolulu. And there was a small halt at Reno on the way, but that was the dead of night, and I was asleep, and I suddenly felt the airplane go cold. It was not It was not because of the entry of Mr. Foote and Mr. Cordier, but just because the door had been opened. We took off again, and we arrived at New York at a time which frankly every one of you knows more than I do, because I was whirled onto the outskirts of the crowd, and leaving my chief to his fate, or rather to his destiny, I took a cab and went home. That, I think, is enough for you to hang a question on, should you care to. If there you find any political overtones in what I've said, ignore them, they're incidental.
Mr. Bokhari, at the dinner you attended, or any of the functions there, could you tell us if any toasts were proposed, and if so, what they were?
I think there was only one dinner at which toast was proposed. And as a matter of fact, I went only to one dinner. That was on the last day. I don't exactly remember the tones, but I think that a toast was certainly proposed to the Secretary General, and a toast in response was certainly proposed to Mr. Chu En Lai. And I think that there were one or two other toasts, but I'm not specific. They were of a general courteous, genial nature. There's nothing particular that I can tell you about them. I don't even remember them, and that was not because I was not in no fit condition to remember them, but there was nothing particularly significant that struck me about them. They were just the courteous, genial toast which you expect at such moments of hospitality.
In Chinese wine?
Yes. Or the Chinese dinner. Of course, the Chinese dinner is an unending business. I consider myself a fair addict of Chinese food on 2nd Avenue and places like that. But I do not propose to go there except both in anger and sorrow when I go next. Somebody has put before me a Chinese menu which I should very much like to read to you. This was the Chinese menu on the last dinner. Would you like me to read this to you? It'll take hours. It begins with the hors d'oeuvre, which is duck in brown sauce, slices of kidney in red oil, salted chicken, fried fish with pepper and salt, celery, cucumber and tomato. Ends the first course. Consommé of swallow's nest, shark's fin and crab meat, green haricot and chicken fat and bamboo shoot in pungent sauce. The operative word is pungent. Abalone and mushroom in brown sauce, stem of broccoli in oyster oil, steamed Peking duck with spice, cauliflower with ham, sweet potato balls and cherries with laurel perfumed syrup, pastry with steamed sweet dumplings with 5 kernels, kernels spelled with a K. And then there's ravioli with meat, fried pastries, and baked yolk pastries. In addition to that, I remember at lunch that we had in the summer palace having various kinds of nests. The life of the swallows must be very hard. And a most delectable dish called mandarin fish in the form of a squirrel, ending up with lotus seed soup, which is extremely beautiful, and a dish called the Mongolian samovar. You don't eat the samovar, you use it for putting various ingredients into it on the table, boiling them there, and scooping out your portions.
Did Mayo present at any of these affairs, or did you toast him, or did you go to see him?
Who?
Mayo Zedong. Mao.
No. I had no contact with him at all. I did not see him. They're reputed to have a very strong wine. I did not taste it, but some people met some people who had tasted it. And it was described not to be weak. Well, as a matter of fact, we could have had it. Some of us did. But the time was so short. If you'll please appreciate that we had one Sunday where we went out to see the Summer Palace and the Ming Tomb. Ming Tomb is 26 miles out of town. Summer Palace is some distance, so they're not in different directions. So that took up the most of the day. On other days, we had a meeting every afternoon beginning at 3. And most of the morning and sometimes part of the evening was taken up in work of various types and study of what had been done before, the evening before. And we had Mr. Hammarskjöld had already given some indication that he had important work here, which indeed he had. And therefore, you see, this had to be very highly concentrated work with a few social functions, not too many, but just enough to, as was necessary for the occasion, thrown in. And that took up most of our time. Otherwise, some of us, one or two of us, the party did go for a little shopping when they had time. And others shop in the usual method, which is very common in the Orient, where the seller, the merchant, comes to the house with his goods. But otherwise, there's very little time indeed.
Can you tell us something about the procedure of, on the arrival and departure of handling the passport? Was it done individually or on a package arrangement? Can you tell us something about...
What kind of departure?
On the arrival and the departure from China, the handling of passports of the mission.
I couldn't tell you at all. All our passports were handed all the way through at every single point in a bundle.
In a bundle.
And we got it back in a bundle. I have not even looked at my passport yet and do not know whether anybody read it at all.
Is there a stamp in it?
I don't know. Probably it was, but they were handed in a bundle to facilitate work, and they were handed back in a bundle. He one day did. He speaks a little English. I think that he can speak more than he did speak. How much more I cannot tell you because I don't know. But during the course of the conversations, he did not use English. He used Chinese,
Also?
which is understandable, yes. So far as I could hear him, but although I have heard him use a few phrases, on more than one occasion he used to say, "See you again."
Official conversations took place, so to speak, in plenary, or if there were cases of somebody discussing some specific thing with his opposite number in the group, and also if in plenary all the talking was done by Mr. Hammarskjöld.
The conversations were entirely done with the team sitting there and entirely by Mr. Chu and Mr. Hammarskjöld. Everybody else was a silent listener and spectator of the conversations.
Can you tell us something about the aspect of speaking in the life of the city?
Well, as I told you, I did not go about much. There was very little time, but I only saw the main streets through which I passed when going to the conference or coming back. And once I went to my embassy, that was all. But there's nothing particular that I could usefully tell you except that it seemed a very busy town, seemed sometimes a crowded town. There were trams and buses, and lots of buildings were being constructed all around and in the outskirts of the town. In other towns, like Canton and Hankow, where of course there were shop signs all over. Canton is an extremely busy town, an extremely crowded town. We tried to read them and tried to remember the symbols that was the same. And finally, one of the party, I think it was the lady of the party, who began to see resemblances between some symbols on most shops, and she was clever enough to see that, and she inquired and found that these were New Year greetings that were repeated all over the place. Similarly, there were other such greetings or other slogans perhaps, or names, but we could not read them. They looked very beautiful. I think there was somebody back there, yes.
Professor Bokhari, I may turn to the more serious side of the issue.
Must you, I mean?
Having participated in this very important mission, are you hopeful of an early solution?
I think that all that is to be said on that subject has been said by Mr. Hammarskjöld. If there's any more to say, I'm sure he'll say it.
Did you get the impression that the people in the city of Peking were aware of your presence and knew why you were there? I mean, I'm not talking now about the group officials with whom you were negotiating, but in general, was the city aware that you were there?
I would not say anything one way or another, because I think it will be useless to me to build anything on the impressions I had. I couldn't tell you. I've not talked to people. If they did talk, I couldn't understand them. I went in a car to one place, came back in another, and I don't think it'll be, I should be satisfied drawing any conclusions from that.
Listen, what access did you have to foreign news there? Did you listen to the radio? Did you have papers in English or anything like that?
We had some papers in English published in China, which we got. There was a radio set in one of the rooms, I think Professor Waldock's room, and Professor Waldock was, I think, even less efficient with machines than I am. Until the last day he went on asking me, does this work, you think? I, not having seen the radio set or been to his room, I couldn't tell him. As a matter of fact, frankly, we were extremely busy, and there were some newspapers in our rooms which we occasionally glanced at, but I suppose the bulk of the newspapers must have been in Chinese. I could not tell you.
Professor Bokhari, would you mind switching your scene of operations and give us a little local color, including the temperature, and I don't mean only meteorologically, in Delhi when you arrived there?
The temperature in?
The temperature, locale, everything that happened in Delhi.
Well, I've told you that my own impression, honest impression of the conversations, and of course I understood one part of the conversation directly and the other part of the conversation in translation, was of great concentration and of great earnestness.
I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. I was speaking of Delhi. Your arrival in Delhi, India.
What was the atmosphere in Delhi?
Yeah, including the temperature and not only meteorologically.
I personally think that so far as I'm concerned, and I think that goes for every member of the party, we were received with the usual and perhaps more than the usual courtesy and hospitality. We stayed at the president's house. The evening we arrived, there was a buffet dinner already had been arranged by the Secretary General of the Foreign Office. And the next morning we went to Mahatma Gandhi's tomb early in the morning to lay flowers on the tomb. The whole party went there, after which we were received by the President, who had then a brief conversation, I think, with Mr. Hammarskjöld. Then Mr. Hammarskjöld went to have a conversation with Mr. Nehru, after which most of the party was invited to Mr. Nehru's house to lunch in a very pleasant garden. Mr. Nehru was a very pleasant host. I think after the lunch, the distinguished guests, there were 2 or 3 ministers of the Central Cabinet, in addition to other guests, and the Secretary General of the Foreign Office, the Foreign Secretary, and I met 2 or 3 of the cabinet ministers who were old friends of mine, like the Education Minister, Dr. Mahmood Hussain, and then the distinguished guests and the host played with a pair of pandas, which were their animals, cat-like animals, which had been sent to Mr. Nehru as a gift, I think, from China. And very soon everybody was behaving like very nice, lovable pets themselves. After which I went into Mr. Nehru's house for a little while to see some of his relations who had not joined the dinner lunch because it was a stag lunch. And then in this very pleasant atmosphere we left.
To your impressions, not political of course, of your impressions of Mr. Chu Enlai as a personality, if you were to put down those impressions in a diary, a non-political diary perhaps.
That is a very difficult question to answer, because all the people I met, Gabriel, like you, are diary-minded people and never keep one. But my general impression is, from the conversations, of course, I don't know anything about the rest of his life. He seemed to me to be a very alert and a very intelligent person who knew what he was talking about and was completely aware of the subject he was discussing all the time.
I don't know if you had the chance to glance through the press cuttings here. All the reports that came from New Delhi were practically the same, that you had a very bad reception, and it was a very cool reception. Now, what is the reason of all this? And now you say, and then in the morning the Secretary General said also that everything was fine. The reports, it wasn't just one reporter, there were 3, 4 agencies reporting the same thing. It was very funny.
Well, there's a story in my language that a man was stung by a scorpion. He howled with pain. People said, "Where have you been stung?" He said, "Who would believe me? Ask the people around me." I've given you our version of the story. I can't do more.
Party any contacts with the local press or other journalists in Peking?
With who?
Journalists. Journalist was another one.
Yes, when we arrived in Peking, we were told that some journalists were on the way, that they had reached Canton and got stuck. Well, we really was rather pleased for their sake, because if they had come up, there was no news to give. So we thought it's much better for them to stay in Canton, where the climate was at least not so cold. But then finally they managed to come up to Peking on the last day of our visit there, we were leaving the next morning. And we were very pleased to see them. One of them was, I think, Spur of the Daily Express. There was one of Agence France. There was a third one whom I do not remember. I did not meet them, or except to say hello. And Mr. Hamishel met them for a few minutes. And as you know, the only news put out from Peking was the agreed communique which you got as well as anybody else in the world. And there was nothing more to give them. But we were very pleased to meet them because they seemed to take the whole adventure in very good spirit. Not that I know of, because frankly, I was in a very happy position. My friend, Mr. Per Lind, who could be trusted to do any job given to him, I in timidity used to pass on every correspondence to him. Whether he came across any Chinese correspondence, I should not be surprised, but I wouldn't know.
I'd like to ask Mr. Bokhari, were there any women in the official Chinese delegation?
I beg your pardon?
Were there any women in the official Chinese party?
Party, I don't know.
I mean in the group.
In the group that held the conversations,
yes.
No woman on either side, I'm ashamed to say.
So therefore, there was one meeting of Mr. Hammarskjöld and Chou En-lai alone, and the rest were with you.
Well, that was not a meeting. I mean, except in so far as whenever two people, prominent people meet, it's always a meeting. Yeah. Mr. Hammarskjöld, the first day of arrival, went to dinner with Mr. Chu without the rest of the party. That's all I can tell you.
And I want to ask another question. Were there meetings taken on verbatim by shorthand?
No, there was no shorthand so far as I know, although I'm sure that everybody interested kept their own notes of the thing.
And then the last one, the communique. How many hours did it take to write that communique?
Well, the communique, you see, the first few communiques were very simple.
No,
it was generally agreed that every day the communique should just give the facts of the meeting and the hour, so there was no difficulty about that. The last communique, being the very last, took a little time discussing, but nothing remarkable.
Because there was no mention of the United Nations General Assembly resolution in the last communique.
You know where you're leading me to, don't you, Kishishin? You know that more than I do.
Sir, on the question of the agreed release of news from the conference, could you possibly tell us how quickly that agreement was reached?
I didn't hear the first part of your question.
I believe there was an agreement reached between Mr. Hammarskjöld and Mr. Chu on the release of news each day from the talks. If you could tell us, it might be interesting to know how soon that agreement was reached.
On the very first day.
How soon on the first day?
Oh, within a matter of few minutes, I think. I mean, you would hardly have noticed it.
Any women in the official reception delegations?
There were women at, for example, the official dinner. Mm-hmm. Certainly one of them was the wife of the Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs. There was another lady, I forget for the moment what her position was.
Any at the airfield reception? Sort of.
Frankly, at the airfield, I was buried in my own cap and coat. I hardly saw anybody. I should not have been surprised if Mr. Hammarskjöld had gone off in one direction and I in another. I was feeling very good.
Professor Bokhari, did you stay at the new Peking hotel or the old hotel?
Well, I was told that, the new and the old are the same. It's only an extension. But we stayed in the older part of the Peking hotel.
Did you dine in your rooms or in the upper or lower rooms?
Well, as a matter of fact, if we, for example, if our business as a group delayed us where Mr. Hammarskjöld was, then we dined or lunched with him there because we couldn't afford the time to come away. But when we dined ourselves, then we were left to ourselves. Then always the Chinese were very kind. They always arranged some sort of a little feast For example, one day that we were, 4 or 5 of us were left there, they arranged a little feast in a room and showed us a colored movie, the first colored movie in Chinese. And those of us who did stay generally dined together in a room. We didn't go to the dining room. That was because we were not supposed to take the trouble of going there, and everything was brought to us as we wanted it.
Since we are greeting you today, also the first time in your new capacity as head of the DPI, would it be all right to ask you whether you can announce to us any new changes in policy, procedure, or such stuff in the DPI that we would all be interested in?
I suppose it'll be all right to ask me, but I don't know the answer. No harm in asking.
Professor Bokhari, was there a ceremonial or token exchange of gifts between the two delegations?
There was no exchange of gifts. I think when we came away, certain small gifts were given, but there was no exchange. I mean, we did not take any gifts.
You spoke of a movie. Can you tell us what type of a movie that
Yes, it was the most harrowing love story. The details are as you might imagine.
Professor Bokhari, were you aware of any special security measures in connection with your visit or movement in the city, in hotels and so far?
Well, frankly, I didn't look for any. I wasn't aware of any.
Journey at any time aware of any gunfire, because during your stay there and your travels there, we had some reports of some attacks at certain points. I was wondering.
No, we were not aware. I was not aware. That's all I can tell you. I was not aware.
Could you describe a little bit the plane, the Chinese plane which you went from Canton up to
Which
Beijing?
plane?
The Chinese plane you took from
It was a 2-engine plane. I'm afraid I don't even know the name of the car till I go up and read it.
Do you know what type of plane was it?
No, I have no idea. I wouldn't be able to tell.
What was the opera you then got to see?
This was in Hankow. I don't know the name, but there were 2 operas that we were shown in Hankow, and they were really very beautiful. One was a small part of a story of a boy who had gone away and a girl who was in love and trying to follow him and trying to cross the river, and the boatman putting various obstacles out of sheer mischief and fun in her way. And this opera consisted entirely of the piece where the boatman and the girl were together. And he would rock the boat or not let her get onto the boat. There was no boat on the stage at all, but both of them moved in unison one way or another. And within half an hour, the most living thing in the opera was not the girl or the boatman, but the river and the boat. The second opera was somewhat more somber in theme. You don't want me to tell you the whole story. Well, if that would be all, I would like to thank you and for your patience, and would beg leave to retire. Thank you very much.